Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Hope you all are doing well on this Passover, Easter, Ramadan time. I know that we are all patiently waiting for some new stuff in this game. But although I've been kind of taking it a little bit slower this season, I did manage to get Mythic last week, just pretty easily. Dropped a couple games here or there, but overwhelmingly felt that everything I was doing with this Garruk list was just performing very, very well. And this is the list that I had run toward the end of last season, and I believe I either got like 11th or 12th for last month, which was cool because usually I end around 15th or 17th. So I felt pretty confident about how, just always trying to improve each season if I can. But I did not want to miss out on, sharing with you all a little sneak preview of when I'll be bringing the tier list. And to be honest, I'm waiting a little bit because I just want to see if we get new planeswalkers, new cards, balance update. Because although I can say confidently I feel like Garruk is just the best creature deck to be playing, and in a lot of ways the best deck to be playing, um, I'm excited to see if there are some changes that shake things up. But today, I just want to do a bit of a Garruk deep dive. For those who have maybe avoided picking him up because you've seen him too much, for those who have maybe had less success than they would hope for on the Planeswalker, or for those of you who are new and are maybe trying to wrap your head around, what is so, what's so powerful about what this Planeswalker does. So I appreciate you sticking with me. As always, please like, subscribe, comment. I love to hear from y'all. I know I've been doing a lot of different tournaments and stuff in the background on our Discord, and if you haven't joined, please do. We just always are streaming or hanging out. It really has become this really awesome community, and we'll just keep working with Wizards of the Coast as well. The folks, Jay and Lucas and other folks in the main Discord, just trying to put on events. So don't forget, at the end of the month, we will be having our Mythic tournament, where as long as you hit Mythic, you can sign up and join the Mythic League tournament. It'll be our second one. So without further ado, and thank you all for always stopping by, let's talk about Garruk. And there are many ways to build him. Just throwing up the list as we talk. Mon Man, most of you know, I believe got number one last month, is also on MTG SS team, or clan, and excellent player, excellent streamer. Just always a pleasure to play against them and to really cheer them on for how incredible their runs were, especially this last month. And Mon Man was like, this is my Garruk list. I've got an over 80% win rate with it. This is what you should be doing. And so, not to say that I know any more than Mon Man does, I've just really preferred this list that specifically Tino, or aka Kraken, had been working on and had been running on the ladder and finished with, in, I think it was either top 5 or top 10 this last month. And I really do prefer this list, and we'll talk about why. But I think, not to get too specific, let's just start with, what is Garruk doing, right? And what this deck is doing with his passive ability, which is, it's free, right? You don't pay a mana cost. You can only do it once per turn. The little axe icon will show up on the left, and you just drag it onto the creature that you want. So what Garruk does very well is pressure the board, right? And every time you're trading off creatures for creatures, right, or you're using removal spells to get rid of their creatures, you're pressuring your opponent, right? You're giving your creature +2/-1, which is a stat trade-off on pretty much every card you would take, especially for the fact that it costs nothing to do it. And so what does he enable in a deck that has this sort of ability? He enables smaller creatures to go bigger. He enables any X2 to come in as a 3/1, right? Those are just some things to keep in mind. And his signature cards are all very strong. Cursebearer, this thing is just such a nightmare when you're thinking about blocking from the other side, right? And I think people often will block Garruk too much, right? They'll block early and often. And I think the way that you beat Garruk, if you're running another mid-range strategy, is really knowing when you have to trade and when you're able to kind of turn the corner on Garruk, so to speak, because it will be a lot of pressure, basically turns 1 through 7. And you're going to have to be answering their creatures, developing your board, and trying your best to kind of stay afloat. Cursebearer really punishes you, because even if you just play it on turn 2, it's a totally serviceable card. And oftentimes what you do is you just get to suit up your 1-drop, 2-drop, or 3-drop, and play Cursebearer afterwards, playing it as a 2-mana 3/4 trampler, and then you have the option, because you've killed something that turn, to put the axe on it and turn it into a 5/3 trample. And you want to be careful, right? When you play against matchups like Chandra and Nahiri a little bit less so, because they just have so much power, it doesn't really matter how high your defense is. So let's talk about Chandra, right? 3 is kind of the magic number, right? Flame shot, being able to maybe shock and burn through something. That's what you have to be keeping in mind. So as soon as you hit 4/5 toughness against Chandra, it's really hard for them to deal with what you're doing. And Cursebearer is just a very, very efficient creature and really rewards you for being aggressive and for just really pressuring your opponent, so that you're getting a lot out of these one-for-one trades with your own creatures. Wildspeaker's Fury is just an excellent removal spell. It is the best unconditional removal spell in the game, right? The only drawback is that you take damage, and just when you play Garruk, you realize very early on you have a ton of life to work with. Taking damage is fine. I honestly love when my opponent just attacks me expecting me probably to block, and I just take it because I'm running Death Shadow. And there are some matchups, even against control, where, of course, it's not wrong for the control opponent to pressure me with a turtle from Teferi or something like that. But it feels like, oh, excellent, I'm getting to take damage, which is taking off mana cost from my Death Shadow. And Wildspeaker Fury does the same thing, right? I can opt in to take the damage to the face, to potentially do that. But also it's just a very efficient card, and it's very easy to set it up to be a 3 mana, get rid of something, you take no damage. And then Veil Curse Predator, I think we can safely say, is the most kind of format warping card that is in Garruk's sort of arsenal. The fact that this thing basically shuts out any aggressive, kind of white weenie, small blue flyers from Yanling strategy, just makes it incredibly oppressive. And the way that it works around, Ward, because it just starts fighting the creatures as well. There's not a lot of ways to play around Veil Curse Predator. The only way you can play around it is all of your creatures have 4 power, right? So that when it attacks the first creature, that just trades 1-for-1 with Predator. And again, in most aggro decks, you're just not going to do that, right? You're not going to be able to set that up. So Veil Curse Predator really basically just kind of has a bit of a stranglehold on any sort of smaller aggressive strategy. And in mid-range, obviously, is still very good, whether it's a 1-for-1, but most times it's a 2-for-1. You eat their 2 power card, their 3 power card, and then you eat their own 4 or 5 power card, right? It just is such a huge tempo swing, and you get rewarded for it because your passive gets buffed, right? You get the +2/-1 for killing something, and you're already developing your board with these really beefy creatures, so that Predator turns into, okay, I kill your board and you take 10 damage. And so Predator, probably out of any card for Garruk, is the one I most expect to be nerfed. Whether that's probably a mana cost increase, which I think would be, a relatively solid option, or potentially both. It coming down to 3 toughness instead of 4 toughness, I think would be a pretty noticeable nerf. It's a card that just really shuts out those aggro strategies, and to be fair, that is what mid-range does. Mid-range is supposed to be bigger, beefier, and address aggressive decks. But the card is just so efficient at what it does for 5 mana. And sometimes you even just eat their thing. They only have 1 creature, maybe against control, and then you get like a 5/1 that just sits on the board, or a 5/2 that you can then turn into a 7/1. So it's a very effective and efficient card, and allows you to close out games kind of out of nowhere. There's no question we want to be running Woodland Hermitage when we think about the deck. Obviously, just having a chance to draw more creatures is excellent. And you're topping out, obviously, Death Shadow is quote-unquote the highest cost creature you have in your deck. And then you're closing out with Confidant on 6 anyway. So you're just never really going to get punished running Woodland Hermitage, right? Very rarely does it actually, really mess up your curve. So it's just the perfect card for that. So I do have Monman's build up, but I do want to focus on this. But what I will say about Monman's build is it's a little smaller, right? They're a little bit more 1-drops. I think, he's also playing Detonator and like some other card choices. And I think at first I was really on top of that. And I still think it's an excellent deck. Like there's no doubt about it. But I think what I love about this build and playing with Tarmagoyf, which I originally thought was not going to be good enough, is that it is better in the mirror, in my opinion, to have Tarmogoyf in your deck. And it is just a really efficient card for making sure that you shore up those aggressive matchups, right? Like Chandra can give you a bit of a run for your money out of those aggressive options, sometimes Nahiri as well. I think Nahiri is a little bit more troublesome for Garry, if I'm being honest. But I think that just having the access to go Tarmogoyf Grudge match, right, or Tarmogoyf Ulvenwald tracker, and we'll talk about tracker specifically, is just where I want to be with this deck. I think even if you're close to this sort of build, I really think you fire this up, you're going to get Mythic very easily. It is just, I think, the best thing you can be doing if you're playing a deck with creatures in your deck. And I mean that by, like, I think Sarah Control's a really good option. I had that video. I appreciate everyone checking that out, and Odyssey for letting us, put out some of that content. I think that, Teferi still has game. I obviously think Nissa does a really great job, too, as a mid-range option, but she almost plays like Control in a way, right? Because you're trying to get to a certain amount of mana to be able to go over your opponent. So I mean, what I mean when I say this is the best creature deck, I mean it's the best kind of aggro mid-range option in all of the Planeswalkers right now. You're able to pressure early, mid, and late. You have diverse threats. You have some of the best threats at your disposal. You have some of the best removal at your disposal. And you've got multiple angles to win the game, which is just incredible. So let's talk about why I decided to go with this version a little bit deeper. Traveler's Supplies, I think we have to talk about for a second. I was really hesitant to put this in my deck. I kept saying to myself, you know what? I really liked it in Drizzt. I really thought that it helped beef up your legendaries, and that really mattered. And I think that that's not a bad claim. But I'd sort of come off it and be like, well, but if you draw it mid-late game, like, sometimes it sits in your hand, it's a terrible top deck, like, don't I just want to be running creatures in my Garruk builds, right? Old scary Garry. But I think again, it is one of those kind of trade-off scenarios where wouldn't you rather have a bigger Predator, a bigger Tarmogoyf, a bigger, the bear, the scare bear, and take a slight hit on having bad draws sometimes. And I feel very passionately that this card is worth it, because the cards that you already have access to as Garruk have really good stats, and the fact that you can push it further for the mirror match, or push it further against decks that are expecting a particular build of Garruk, means that it's a lot harder to play around, right? Like Predator going from a 5/4 to a 6/5 or a 7/6 potentially is a huge difference. And the same thing goes for a Tarmogoyf that gets, +6 versus +8, and so on and so forth. So Have I drawn this at awkward times? Yes. Have I drawn it in the late game? Yes. But I can say pretty clearly it's never felt like bad. Like unless I'm already behind, like Traveler Supplies is not great. But at the start of the game, even in the early stages of the game, the card's just always going to be what you want. And I think that you get enough out of it that it is worthwhile. So I've been really, really happy with the card. And the obvious interaction to play it is with Tarmogoyf, right? Because Tarmogoyf gets rewarded for more different card types in your deck. And so when you have 2 artifacts to potentially boost him for another +2/+2, it feels very, it's, you're doing this package intentionally. And I do think that the package is good enough. I'm really satisfied with the fact that we have 4 1-drops, Travel Supplies and Channeler of Might. You could play, you know, the Cranial Consultant, which I think is probably one of the best 1-drops right now. You could play Markov's Chosen. You do have options, but I think at the end of the day, I want more of my good 2-drops. I want more of my good 3-drops and 4-drops. And I feel very, just kind of clear, I would say, about this is the direction that I think the deck will be moving in or is already moving toward. Because I do think that it is just, it's beefier and it's able to outmuscle even more. So, the other staples I would say that you'll see in every Garruk deck, Dark Confidant, this thing is just exactly what you want. You can make it a 4/1, you can make it a 5/1. You're trading with something, you're drawing a card. And that's the thing, is like you get the best of both worlds. They want to trade for it because they don't want you to draw cards. You're fine with trading it off because you get rewarded for fighting creatures in combat. And you're going to win. Like Dark Confidant it's always going to be at least a 4/1, right? Which means it gets past most blockers, in the sense that they trade off. And the 2 damage doesn't matter. Oftentimes it's good for your Death Shadow. And the drawing a card just means that you can just keep continually applying pressure. Infectious Scorpion, love this card in this deck if you have not tried it. So baseline, you can make it a 3/2, you can make it a 4/2, right, with the passive. And the Doom spell, the Fatal Infection, is actually super, super relevant. The way that it plays with the deck is it's super nice. So because when you put that on during your turn, right? And then the next turn they're usually going to attack you, right? Because the card's going to die. They get in some damage, and then it dies on your turn, right? So what Fatal Infection does is it turns on your Cursebearer, it turns on your passive, it turns on your Wildspeaker's Fury, it turns on your Gluttonous Goo. So I think if you have not played Infectious Scorpion, you're really overlooking a 2-drop that has a ton of utility in the deck and generally plays very, very well. They don't really want to block this, right? Easy to get chip damage with it. Even when you doom their creature and they attack you, you have 27 health to work with, so you're often just going to take it and it's totally fine. So it does act as just more cheap removal in your deck. So I really think that that card is excellent. Tarmogoyf, I just think that it performs very well. It's so easy for this to be a 2-mana 4/5, and in a world where you're trying to outmuscle Garruk, I think you want to be doing that. You want to be growing your Tarmogoyf to be another threat, to be able to grudge match their biggest creatures, to block their biggest creatures, and trade with their biggest creatures. So I'm really in on the Tarmogoyf package. Grudge match, no-brainer. Even if you trade off 2 for 1, but you get to make your other creature very, very big and swing in, right? Or turn on your other abilities that Wildspeaker's Fury and Ooze and stuff like that. But I would say most of the time you're just getting to 1 for 1 grudge match against their card. Your card survives. You pump something else, you swing, and you just do so much damage to your opponent, like really out of nowhere. Cursebearer, or the Scary Berry. This card is just, it's such a terror in the early game. Like, it just always feels like, as Garruk, you are setting the pace of the game, because your opponent has to think about you having this card. And I think if you're playing against Garruk and you're not thinking about it, you're losing some potential percentage points to win the game. It is a card you want to consider. You always want to be asking yourself, what do I get out of blocking if they get to slam Cursebearer or Ooze, or get to Wild Speaker's Fury for free, right? Like, you should kind of ask yourself those questions, because that is how Garruk gets ahead. Drana, I think this was said early and often by most players who have played Garruk, she just can run away with the game. I had a pretty epic game against Nissa when I was climbing earlier this week, where I got my Drana to be like a 9-10 or something like that, and it truly did win me the game. When your opponent's not able to answer this, and I will caution, I would not play this on the board, even if your opponent has no creatures, and immediately turn it into a 3-2. The fact that it does have 3 toughness does allow it to dodge certain removal spells, and there's just really no reason for you to do it on your turn. Yes, there is a reason. The reason is that you can make it a 4-1 on the following turn, attack. Yes, it gets the 4 health back. But I think I would say more often you're better off allowing it to dodge some of that removal, so it has the likelihood to connect the following turn. And who knows, you may be able to kill a creature the next turn anyway. You make it into a 4-2, you attack, it becomes a 4-5. Or sorry, a 4-6. And Drana can just run away with the game. So if you haven't crafted this card and you've been thinking about it, you should make it for this deck. It's a very clear, just excellent threat. And that's what I mean. They have to deal with your Dark Confidant. They have to worry about blocking your Scorpion, your Tarmogoyf, your Cursebearer. And then you also have cards like Blood Queen Drana, which like they have to answer. So that's what I mean by sort of the power of this deck. And then we have another all-star, I really think, Ulvenwald Tracker. I've said this in my other Domri videos, my other Ajani videos, right? I think this card has a lot of utility in those decks. It almost feels like it has even more utility in this deck. Because you don't really care about trading your creatures 1-for-1, right? In fact, it actually makes things better. The floor with this card often, right? You're never going to play it when you don't have a creature out, unless that's all you have to play. So I would say the floor is almost always you trade your creature for their creature, and then you turn your Ulvenwald Tracker into a 5-1. And it may not seem like that's that good, but the fact that Ulvenwald Tracker becomes an actual threat, instead of just kind of a dorky 3-2 body that you get afterwards, is very relevant, because often what you're doing is you're getting on the board early, and then you get to decide, okay, here, I'm going to play Tracker, trade for their creature, make my Tracker big. Next turn, I can play Predator, eat their 2 creatures, right? And it's just like, the fact that you get like a 5-1 body out of it, like pretty much every time you're playing it, right, is a real advantage. And I think Tracker is specifically more synergistic with Tarmogoyf, right? Because Tarmogoyf often is going to have, 5 toughness, right? Or 7 toughness. And so it just allows you to trade for a creature, then you can make Tarmogoyf more threatening, or often I'll be very happy to throw the axe right back to Ulvenwald Tracker so he can catch it here, and become a 5-1. And I just really think that the fact that you can have this potentially trade with like an Ooze across the board, right? That's an X5, is pretty annoying, especially in the mirror match. So I can't talk up Ulvenwald Tracker enough. Now the one of Wyrmswake, I think you could play 2. I really don't think it's crazy to play 2, but I had just found that I just became very, very happy with this build, and I think the one of Wyrmswake is perfect, right? It's like your opponent's not necessarily going to put you on having a Wyrmswake. It obviously gives you another card type to buff Tarmogoyf to be that +8, which sometimes is extremely relevant, and it's just an efficient card. I really could see you playing 2 of this. I think if we see like a ton more control, and I think Sarah's a really good option, as we've talked about, but also potentially Teferi. Wyrmswake, I think, is a lot more attractive, because even if at worst you're soaking up a negate or something like that, especially against Teferi, you get to do that. You get that out of their hand. You might need Wild Speaker's Fury. You might want to slam something else, right? And you can guarantee seeing that trap on that turn. So Worm's Wake, not much to say here, just like a fine include. Wild Speaker's Fury, said it already, the card's just extremely efficient. It's one of the best ways to answer Death Shadow as well, right? It's just an excellent removal spell. And I think the just sheer amount of interaction and removal that this deck gets kind of for free is really scary, right? It's like you get the Fatal Infections, you get Grudge Match, you get Ulvenwald Tracker, you get Wild Speaker's Fury, and you get Veil Curse Predator. You have so many ways to interact with the board, and you're setting the tone and pace of the game often. And that just allows you to really drive as much damage towards your opponent with all of these kind of like removal spells tacked onto creatures like Ulvenwald Tracker and Predator and Infectious Scorpion. And then you get just a really good unconditional removal spell in Wild Speaker's Fury. All right. Got to give credit to the king here, Tino, a.k.a. Kraken. Tino's been playing with Silent Strike for forever. I think I talked about it in my Vraska video as a one-of. I really love this card as a one-of. I think even some players are playing it as a two-of, which I can understand because as mid-range matchups become more prevalent, which I think is where the meta is right now, Silent Strike is a really good option because often what will happen is you're both developing your boards, you're trading resources, then you slam some of your bigger creatures. Maybe you don't want to trade them off. Maybe you want to wait until you've got a removal spell or some other interaction. And you just get your opponent so low that Silent Strike is almost always reading as +3, -1, right? Because it's almost like you add your passive on top of Silent Strike. And it just means that any card is doing minimum 5-6 damage with Silent Strike. And if you think about how your games curve out, it's just really easy to get your opponent sub 10 life, by turn 6 or 7. And so then Silent Strike is just another angle where you can't interact with it, right? It's just like you hope your opponent doesn't have any creatures that are lethal. Again, Ulvenwald Tracker being a 5-1, right? This turns into a 7-1 and hits your opponent for 7 unblocked damage. And I've had games where I'll maybe resolve my Kothafed, and against Garruk, I would, in a lot of spots, I'm probably just going to make it a 12-12, but there might be some spots where I'm drawing the cards, right? And let's say Kothafed is unblocked, and then you make your big ground guy that could be blocked into an unblockable creature with Sneak. So I think I've been skeptical of this card at times, but I just got to take it from Tino that this is just a really, really good kind of angle for mid-range black decks to win the game. Obviously, not to mention Death Shadow, right? It's like you're clocking your opponent for 15 minimum, 16 if you count your passive. So it's kind of a no-brainer. Krav, just a really efficient, scary creature. Often this thing, with your Traveler Supplies, it just comes in as an 8/8, a 9/9. The thing is really scary. 6 damage is not a drawback. You either can sack your Venomous Scorpion or something that doesn't matter, or you take the damage to the face and you reduce the cost of your Death Shadow. There's just really no downside to this card. And it gets super huge. It's doing a ton of damage. It's often surviving combat to attack twice. Just an excellent beefy card. Speaking of beef, you will notice we have a lot of 4-drops in this version. And again, I think that this is the way that I want to play Garruk. And I would encourage you to play Garruk too. General Eladmri. I have taken this card out. I've put it back in. I've sort of tinkered around with why I dislike this card and why I like this card. Dislikes, right? It's obviously a card that's not hard to just kill, to get rid of, right? Especially in the Garruk matchups, right? They could just Wild Speaker's Fury it. You get nothing out of it, right? Whereas with Ooze, they're not going to be able to target it, right? As long as you've triggered the debut. And so, Ooze is just such a powerful card in this deck. But what General has going for it is if it does not die, even if it gets one attack and one attack only, and when you have Traveler Supply in your deck, you're getting it up into the 6/5 range, the 7/6 range. A little harder for your opponent to deal with it that easily. it just makes such a huge difference. It's just a Traveler Supply to everything in your hand. You get spotted a 1/1 that turns into a 2/2, and therefore, at minimum, you can make it into a 3/1 with your passive or a 4/1 with your passive. I think you should be running this card. Hopefully you can craft it. I know it is an expensive one. It just, the potential for you to top deck this when your opponent and you are trading resources, and you get to play this and make a free 4/1 or 3/1 and buff very relevant cards in your hand, like Predator, like Ulvenwald Tracker, is just a very, very good upside to the card. So as much as I hate it when I play it and it dies, when it does not die, it's really hard for you to lose the game. And I do think that it's worthwhile. Obviously, it counts also towards your Channeler of Might count, which is, I mean, you got plenty of things that buff that, but I really think that he's worth it. Gluttonous Goo, nothing to say here. Auto-include, if you're not playing this, play it. The card's insane. It's always going to be a 7/7 pretty much all the time, and then it's really easy to make it a 9/6. They can't get rid of it unless they've got a 6-power Predator. And this thing is just such a house in the mid-range matchups. It's so hard for decks to deal with this when you get to play this on turn 4 as a 7/7 ward. Velcrus Predator, nothing to say. Card's incredible. Kothafed, if you are playing black mid-range or control, and this card is not in your deck, you're doing something wrong. The fact that it can be a 12/12 to play around Lava Wave, and we've sort of... I'll pause here for a second. Lava Wave was kind of the terror of the format last season, right? And then people adjusted, then people are playing Garruk, then you're playing Death Shadow. I feel like now Lava Wave is like not really scary, right? I mean, like, we knew Kothafed was good into it. We knew Death Shadow was good into it. We knew that, you know, if you're able to trade enough resources and pressure your opponent, sometimes it doesn't matter if they have Lava Wave. So I feel like Lava Wave is not like this scary thing to be afraid of, because not everyone's playing Nissa anymore, and not everyone's playing Domri. Why is that? Because Garruk is just, I think, a better deck. Garruk is able to, I feel totally fine, if not favored against Nissa most of the time. I think the matchup is good for you. You have to be making specific card choices for Nissa to be better. And I think you're just out pressuring Domri, right? Which was another deck that I love playing that ran Lava Wave. So this is just my way of saying, like, I don't think Lava Wave matters as much anymore. Maybe it'll get nerfed, and therefore maybe it lets certain other archetypes be a little bit more effective. But honestly, at this point, I think Garruk has just doesn't care. This deck just doesn't care if you have Lava Wave in your deck. They're going to pressure you early, and if you stumble, it's going to be hard for you, and then they're just going to play a Kothafed at some point in Death Shadow. What are you going to do? Right? So play this card. If you're playing black, it just does a ton of work. We're not in a tempo sort of like blue bouncing stuff kind of format. So Kothafed is just excellent. And oftentimes I'll have these turns later on in the game where I get to Kothafed, deal 4 damage to myself, and that reduces my Death Shadow down to be able to go Kothafed Death Shadow. Obviously, optimal case, but it's just one of those interactions where you're not really thinking about it, but just taking damage to your face feels totally fine in this deck. You got to be careful, obviously sub 10 life and things like that, but getting yourself down to, 15 or lower, and you're developing your board and your opponent can't really attack through your stuff, like, it just is straight upside when you're playing Death Shadow in your deck. Which brings me to Death Shadow. Also, I love the art for this card. It's just like such a cool looking card. I should probably get the foils at some point. I feel like Death Shadow has become the most defining creature in the format. Now, it was more of a threat and is still the best utilized in Davriel. I stand by that, because although Davriel, and I'll kind of let you guys into my tier list when I make it, and I'm going to give it maybe another week and see how things shake out. I think that Davriel is not a great option. Can you get to Mythic with it? Yes. Can you win games with it? Yes. But it's not consistent enough, in my opinion. And it also really struggles with Garruk unless you have those high roll Death Shadow games where you get them early and often, I think Garruk's favored. So I don't want to really pick up or play a deck that doesn't really have a game plan that's super consistent for beating Garruk. So Death Shadow, I think, over Lava Wave has become the scariest thing. It's super enabled by Davriel. It's very, very easy and excellent in this deck. I think even Vraska, people are thinking about picking it up. I've seen people think about Nissa with Death Shadow. The card is just really hard to deal with. Now, it's important to note that Garruk has some good use cases for Death Shadow, and it has the best answer to Death Shadow in Wildspeaker's Fury. So this is why when you're playing Garruk, it just, like, to me, and I said it was Jund, right? You're just playing the strongest cards. I still feel that way. I feel like you just get access to the best, like the top of the line for what you're doing. And so just the extreme privilege that Garruk has to be able to play Death Shadow, the best creature threat in the game, even with Day of Judgment here and there, right? And you have the best answer to it in your own deck is just, how can I spell it out any more that Garruk is just the best deck to be playing. And Death Shadow, often how this will play, you don't want to have this in your starting hand. Like with Davriel, it was totally fine. It was actually really easy to enable. I went back and forth, like, should I keep this, should I not? But in this deck, it's sort of like this like hidden threat, right? Like they know you're going to be playing this card, and still what you're going to do is you're going to exhaust them of resources with all of your early game interaction and card advantage that you get from your creatures and the fight spells and all of that, and buffing your creatures with your passive. Then at some point you're just going to play your Death Shadow on turn 6, 7, 8. And if they don't have an answer for it, you probably are going to win that game. So it's just, again, the threat density in this deck, the synergy, the aggression, the ability to just, like, have so much card advantage in the form of your creatures makes it so that when you land your Death Shadow, it's not always really that likely that your opponent's going to be able to deal with it. So Death Shadow, not great in your opening hand, is Garruk. I don't want to, oversell you on the card. But it is just an auto-include. You've got 27 life. Like I said, every time your opponent is dealing damage to you that you know, as a Garruk player, is not going to kill you, that you know is really not going to do much of a difference, it's just their only way of trying to pressure you. I'm just like, all right, great. I can't wait until I draw my Death Shadow, and it's 3, 4, 5, 6 cheaper than it would have been. So you get to play this really almost like cheeky game of like, yeah, that's fine. Keep attacking me. That's okay. I'll be able to play my Death Shadow later. And actually, it'll come down earlier than you might have expected. And I'm also pressuring you. So just to kind of wrap up the sort of deep dive of the deck, you have so many ways to win the game. You've got heavy hitters like Death Shadow, Kothafed, Eladmeri, Goo, Krav, right? And those are your heavy hitters for sure. You've also got the angle of Silent Strike. And then you've also got these hyper-efficient 2-drops, right, that give you card advantage. And that's the thing. It's just like, it never seems to let up. It has to be very awkward for Garruk for him not to be pressuring you every single turn. And he just does it so well. So whether he gets nerfed in terms of his signature cards, or whether he loses some life, which I think would be a reasonable nerf, I do think that would affect him. He really has it all, folks. That's kind of the best way I can say it. And I would say if you're picking up Garruk for the first time, you can build him a lot of different ways. And I think you can do so many different things. You can have more 1-drops. You can have more top end. You can maybe go bigger than what I'm doing, which was something I tried when first early on. But I've sort of settled on this like mid-range, like very mid-range build of Garruk, and felt that it just performs incredibly well. I think in my run to Mythic, which took 2-3 hours max, I dropped maybe a handful of games, and it just didn't really matter what my opponent was doing. I'm just always playing my creatures and applying pressure. I've got the same amount of cards in my hand, if not more so than my opponent. And just the pressure never stops. Your opponent has to consider every single block, and you're just kind of like free rolling these great cards in your deck. And it just takes your opponent one turn where they can't play around Predator or Tracker, or they didn't account for your Silent Strike for you to end the game. So I think if you're trying to hit Mythic, if you're interested in Garruk, this is the way to do it. And I really think that if you want this season to be your season, whether like before we see potential like balance updates or whatever else, I just think you should be playing this deck. And I would love to hear in the comments what you all think and where things are at for you. So I think we'll kind of wrap up here for today. I've definitely, full transparency, been feeling a little less motivated to put stuff up, on the channel for Magic Spellslingers, just because I think we're all hopeful that there could be some new stuff around the corner. But I didn't want to just assume everyone is thinking the way that I am. So I wanted to put out a deck that I feel 100% is just the best thing you could be doing in a lot of ways, especially when you're climbing. And we'll definitely still get that tier list video coming up soon. Spoiler, it hasn't changed all that much from the last one, but there's some tweaks I definitely have made. And anyway, best of luck on your Mythic climbs. Best of luck on your just playing this game in general. I hope we get more folks. We had a Pauper tournament this weekend over at the LGS Discord. We're going to be having a couple other formats coming up. So despite nothing in the game really changing with this reset, come through. We're going to make things fun. We have the community there. And hopefully I'll see you around the channel a little bit more this week, because I think we've got some good content coming up, and I've got the time to do it. So thanks for sticking with me, and I will catch you next time.